For over a century, Europe sat at the top of the global car industry. BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Audi, these weren't just car makers, they were cultural icons. To own one was to own the benchmark of luxury, engineering, and prestige. For generations, if you wanted the best car in the world, you didn't look to Japan or America. You bought European. That was the unwritten rule. But the ground is shifting beneath their feet, and it's shifting faster than most people realize. The very companies that created the modern automobile are now staring at the possibility of losing the very business they built. And the reason? A cocktail of regulatory overconfidence, spiraling costs, and a stunning underestimation of how aggressively China would move into the electric car race. What's unfolding is nothing less than a business earthquake. Some analysts are already calling it the most expensive policy mistake Europe has made in modern times, worth more than €500 billion. Europe's shrinking car market. The clearest proof that something's wrong is in the numbers. In theory, this should be the golden age of car sales. We're in the middle of the electric vehicle, EV revolution. Demand should be surging, and automakers should be riding that wave. Instead, European car sales are slipping. In the first 7 months of 2025, EU car sales fell by 0.7%. That may sound like a small dip, but in context, it's massive. Imagine Netflix losing subscribers in the middle of the streaming boom. That's how unusual this is. And it's not just a blip. Since 2019, Western Europe has lost about 2.5 million car sales annually. That's the equivalent of the entire Spanish auto market disappearing every year. In just the first half of 2025, Europe sold 1.56 million fewer cars compared to the same period in 2019. These are the years when EV adoption should have sent numbers through the roof, yet instead, the market is shrinking. EV growth without European winners. Here's where the story takes a strange turn. Electric and hybrid cars are indeed gaining ground. In 2025, they already make up 60% of new car sales in Europe, up from 51% just a year earlier. Germany's EV sales jumped 38%. Belgium saw a 17% increase. Even in the Netherlands, already a strong EV market, sales rose 6%. Clearly, European consumers are moving to electric. But the winners aren't European companies. Chinese brands have stormed into the market, doubling their share in just 6 months. BYD, a company virtually unknown in Europe 5 years ago, sold more than 70,000 cars in the first half of 2025 alone. That's a staggering 311% increase from last year. To put that in perspective, Tesla, the undisputed global EV leader, saw its European sales collapse by 40% over the same period. Meanwhile, Stellantis, one of Europe's biggest automakers, threw in the towel on its pledge to go fully electric by 2030. Volkswagen is burning through cash trying to repair factories that once printed money. Even when Europeans win, they're losing ground. Regulations turn into traps. At the core of the crisis is regulation. Europe set ambitious CO2 reduction targets for 2025, 2030, and 2035. Automakers that miss these targets face fines so severe they could wipe out profits. On paper, it looked like a clean solution. Push every company to sell zero-emission vehicles or pay a heavy penalty. But the reality in 2025 is very different. Car makers are finding demand weaker than expected, costs exploding, and infrastructure nowhere near ready. The charging network isn't wide enough, battery supply chains are shaky, and the transition is moving faster than legacy car makers can manage. This has led to something you rarely see in Germany. Automakers and trade unions standing on the same side. Together, they're pressuring the EU to either delay or soften the 2035 ban on combustion engines. Mercedes CEO Ola Källenius even called for a reality check, warning that the ban, if left unchanged, could destabilize the entire European car market. But they face stiff resistance. More than 150 leaders from Europe's EV ecosystem, including battery makers and grid operators, are urging the EU to hold firm or even push harder. They argue that weakening the rules now would cripple competitiveness and scare off vital investment. The EU finds itself in a tug-of-war, bend to the cries of struggling legacy automakers, or risk sacrificing its climate agenda in future industrial base. The cost crisis. While regulation gets the headlines, the deeper issue is costs. Europe's car industry has simply become too expensive to compete. Consider this. BYD can manufacture a car in Europe for around 25,000 euros. That's already 25% more expensive than making the same car in China. But it's still 10,000 euros cheaper than what most European companies can produce. A 10,000 euro gap per vehicle is not just inconvenient, it's existential. To make matters worse, forecasts predict Europe will need to cut hundreds of thousands of units of production in the next 5 years. That leaves many plants sitting underused, but still expensive to maintain. Suppliers, from parts makers to battery specialists, are also squeezed. They must either invest heavily to upgrade, relocate to cheaper regions, or close altogether. China's playbook. Chinese car makers didn't just enter Europe. They rewrote the rules. Their growth numbers are explosive. BYD's registrations jumped more than 300% year over year in early 2025. But the real secret isn't just demand, it's the supply chain. Chinese battery giant CATL is opening a massive factory in Hungary in late 2025, designed to produce 100 gigawatt hours annually. That's enough to supply not just Chinese brands, but many European ones as well. BYD is also localizing production by building plants in Hungary and Turkey. The strategy is brilliant. Once they build in Europe, tariffs and shipping costs vanish, and suddenly they're not a foreign company. They're local, and they're not stopping there. Plans are underway for Chinese luxury EV brands aimed at 2027 launches, along with charging networks and service centers to support customers long-term. The Chinese approach combines low costs, aggressive scaling, and the ability to offer premium quality at prices European companies can't touch. Tariffs backfiring. Europe's initial reaction to the Chinese invasion was predictable. Slap tariffs on imported EVs. In 2025, the EU imposed duties between 17% and 38% on top of the standard 10% import tax. In theory, some Chinese models are paying nearly 50% extra in tariffs. That should have stopped them cold, except it didn't. Carlos Tavares, CEO of Stellantis, pointed out that the tariffs may actually be backfiring. Rather than deterring Chinese brands, the tariffs push them to build factories inside Europe. Now, local European workers will find themselves competing directly with brand-new, hyper-efficient Chinese plants on their own soil. Even with the tariffs, many Chinese EVs remain profitable because of their rock-bottom production costs. Meanwhile, European automakers are in a bind. They can't escape their own high costs, and they still rely heavily on China for sales and manufacturing. The factory fallout. The consequences are already visible. Suppliers and manufacturers are shutting down plants across Europe. Volkswagen has put its Brussels site up for sale. Bosch, Valeo, and even Stellantis are scaling back or freezing operations, especially in facilities tied to combustion engine technologies. Job losses are no longer a forecast. They're happening. More than 60% of suppliers say they're struggling with excess capacity, high costs, and weakening demand. Europe's once mighty industrial base is eroding in real time. How Europe's car makers are reacting. Faced with this storm, strategies are diverging. Some companies are attempting bold pivots, while others look like they're scrambling for survival. Volkswagen is chasing affordability, aiming to launch an EV priced around 25,000 euros with its upcoming ID Cross. BMW is sticking to premium, betting on its Neue Klasse EX3 SUV due in 2026, promising higher range, faster charging, and advanced tech. Renault is going pragmatic, switching to cheaper lithium iron phosphate LFP batteries for all models by 2026 to cut costs. Stellantis abandoned its all-electric by 2030 pledge, admitting it can't keep up. Mercedes and Audi are cutting costs and restructuring, but clinging to their luxury branding as their core defense. Whether these strategies will be enough remains to be seen. But time is short. Europe's crossroads. The irony of the situation is striking. Europe created the most aggressive policy framework in the world for an EV revolution. But in doing so, it built an ecosystem that favors outsiders. Chinese companies are thriving in the very market Europe worked so hard to reshape. The lesson here is not that the transition to EVs is a mistake. The urgency of climate goals is real, And the policy logic is sound. The problem is execution. Europe set ambitious deadlines without first ensuring that infrastructure, supply chains, and cost structures were in place to support the transition. Now the bill is coming due. Higher prices, shrinking sales, layoffs, and growing dependence on foreign suppliers. If Europe can't fix its cost base, strengthen its supply chain, and find a way to make EVs affordable for average people, the continent that invented the modern car may end up losing its place at the head of the table. But the story isn't over yet. Europe still has deep engineering expertise, strong brands, and loyal customers. The path forward exists, but it requires swift, coordinated action. Dreams don't vanish in an instant. They fade through neglect. Right now, the clock is ticking, and Europe has to decide whether it wants to fight for the future of its car industry or surrender it. That was all from us today for this video, folks. For more similar content, make sure to subscribe to Rev Without Roar. See you in the next one.